Hello everyone, I welcome you all in this course Introduction to Sequence Stratigraphy, and today we are going to discuss on something different. So, we will be introducing a new concept in this particular course. The name of the topic is sea level changes, and we will try to understand different aspects of sea level change, the causes and effects of those different aspects of sea level changes on sedimentation. Before we start, I would like to tell you that sea level change is one of the primary important constituent which we consider for development or framing of any sequence stratigraphic model or for any kind of interpretation in the frame of sequence stratigraphy, because the cyclicity in successions and the characteristic stratal stacking pattern, they are commonly associated with the sea level changes and the corresponding changes in the depositional regime, in the depositional rim, which results in these variations in the stratal stacking pattern. So, in sequence stratigraphy, we try to demarcate these sea level changes in the frame of those stratal stacking patterns. So, we all know that sedimentation, it is generally controlled by a combination of autogenic and allogenic processes. As we have already discussed in our previous lectures, that autogenic factors are those which are mostly the basinal processes confined within the basin scale, whereas allogenic factors are much larger factors and they operate across the basins, maybe across the entire globe, and they can have much larger effect. So, these factors determine the distribution of depositional elements within a particular depositional system. When we are talking about the depositional elements, that means the different types of facies and the facies associations and their 3D assemblages. As well as these factors, they also control the larger scale stacking patterns of the depositional systems within a particular sedimentary basin. So, as already we have discussed about the control factors related to autogenic and allogenic processes, and we already know that how these processes control the different types of cyclicities within the sedimentary successions. So, we will just refer back to that particular concept, and with that particular background, we will try to understand that what happens in terms of sea level changes and what are the role of these autogenic and allogenic factors in controlling the sea level changes. We already know that autogenic factors or autogenic processes are mostly confined within the subdepositional system scale. So, that means that when we talk about the facies associations, which are basically representation of the different processes which goes on within a particular depositional environment or a part of a depositional environment. So, autogenic factors are mostly confined in terms of those basinal processes, and they are commonly studied using the methods of conventional sedimentology and the traditional facies analysis. So, again already we have discussed about the details of facies analysis, different steps of facies analysis and how we interpret from those studies. On the other hand, the allogenic processes which commonly act or operate on a much larger scale, in a much wider scale, are directly relevant to sequence stratigraphy, because they commonly control the larger scale architecture of the basin fill. As at the very beginning of this particular course, I told you that in sequence stratigraphy, we try to understand or we try to look into the types of succession formed across the entire basin, and from there we try to interpret or we try to reconstruct the series of events that has occurred in that particular basin across time. So, definitely allogenic processes which are actually occurring or operating across the entire basin can have a much detailed or profound effect in controlling the sedimentation, in controlling the stratigraphic succession across the entire basin, which we can easily correlate. And so, for understanding the basin scale processes and evolution of different sedimentary environments across the entire basin, it is important to understand and interpret the allogenic processes occurring in that particular basin. Commonly, all stratigraphic cycles of different orders, already we discussed about these different orders like first order, second order, third order and fourth and fifth order, they commonly represent or they commonly form through the interplay of two major allogenic factors. One is definitely the tectonics, which commonly control whether a particular basin will go through some subsidence or maybe some exhumation. And the second important factor is the eustatic sea level change. That means the global sea level fluctuations with respect to formation of supercontinents, fragmentation of supercontinents, formation of glacier, continental scale glaciers or deglaciation events. So, mostly the climatic events. So, they control whether there will be some tectonoeustasy or there will be some glacioeustasy. So, definitely the eustatic changes differ in magnitude and their duration. And along with these two factors, a third factor also comes into consideration, sediment supply. This sediment supply, which is kind of a mix up of both allogenic and autogenic control process, because sediment formation, sediment derivation and its transport is controlled by the autogenic processes. But definitely the amount of weathering, the amount of erosion, the amount of transportation, the area of deposition, these are very often controlled by the allogenic factors as well. So, these three factors, tectonics, eustatic sea level changes and sediment supply, these are the three prime factors which control what will be the nature of stratigraphic cycle in a particular basin. So, together tectonics and eustasy, they create the accommodation space where sediments can accumulate, and when sediments accumulate in response to the available accommodation produced by tectonics and eustasy, what we get is the stratigraphic cycles, which actually indicates the interplay of this accommodation available and the amount of sediment coming within that particular accommodation space for the accumulation. Now, the basinal condition, the condition prevailing in that particular depositional environment will control or decide that whether that particular sediment which is supplied into the system will be accommodated or not, which depends on the energy condition and many other factors. So, this we can represent through a very simple diagram. So, maybe we can just think of three end members, the tectonics, second one is the climate, which actually controls the eustasy. So, this is actually the eustasy. So, these two or rather these three together are actually the allogenic factors or allogenic processes. So, these allogenic factors can have two-way effect. Number one, they will control the energy condition of that particular basin, which will again decide that how much sediment will be transported, carried, supplied. So, definitely the sediment supply and how much of that supplied sediments will be finally accumulating. Now, for that accumulation of sediment, what we require is the space which we call as the accommodation space or simply the accommodation. So, this accommodation is nothing but the volume of basin or the basinal part available for the accumulation of sedimentation. So, this accommodation is directly controlled by tectonics and eustasy. These two factors together contribute in the creation of accommodation. How they control that? By changing the volume of the basin itself or by changing the volume of water body. These two together will control what will be the accommodation available for the accumulation of sediment. But at the same time, it may happen that accommodation may be available, but the sediments which are supplied are not accumulating finally because of some energy condition available or prevailing in that particular basin. So, when these two factors match together, complement each other, then what we get is the final sedimentary succession. Final sedimentary succession, and definitely this sedimentary succession will have certain depositional trend or some sort of stratal stacking pattern. So, that stratal stacking pattern indicates the organization of different depositional systems formed under these conditions. So, these allogenic factors, which are the primary factors controlling dominantly the accommodation creation, and whether that accommodation will be fully utilized and how that accommodation will be utilized is controlled by some other factors, which is actually a combination of autogenic and allogenic factors working in that particular basin, and these factors together, the allogenic and autogenic factors in combination with accommodation and sediment supply, will finally decide or determine that what will be the nature of stratal stacking pattern in that particular basin during that particular phase of deposition. So, sea level changes can be either represented by variations in the masses or volume of the oceans, that is the amount of water available in the ocean that can vary, sometime it can be increased, sometime it can be decreased, as well as the amount of ocean basin itself, its volume can be changed. So, when any of these two occurs or maybe a combination of these two occurs together, what we get is variation in the masses or volume of the ocean, or alternatively we can also get some change in the sea level in terms of some reference point, maybe some reference point on the land, and with respect to that we get some change in the sea surface. So, in either of these two cases we get a change in the sea level, and in the first case where we are getting a change in sea level due to change in mass or volume of the ocean, we call it as eustatic sea level change, which means global sea level change, or when it is with respect to the sea surface and a reference point on the land, it is called as a relative sea level, which is commonly demarcated within a particular basin, which is a local relative sea level change. So, in today's class we will try to concentrate on this particular aspect, the eustatic sea level change. We will try to understand what are the causes of eustatic sea level change, what are the effects of eustatic sea level change, and in the next class we will discuss about the relative sea level change. Eustatic sea level changes are commonly derived by or driven by different types of factors, mostly the allogenic factors, because these are global scale events. So, definitely the factors are not only confined within a particular basin, but they are occurring or operating across the entire globe. So, those processes or those factors that causes changes in the volume or mass of the world oceans commonly result in a globally uniform mean sea level variations, and that is why we get overall changes in terms of the sea level condition across the globe. So, either we can get an eustatic rise in sea level or eustatic fall in sea level. So, eustatic sea level changes are global and these are independent from local factors, local controls, local geological processes. For examples, some local tectonic events, maybe some local faulting which is causing some local scale basin subsidence or exhumation. So, global sea level change or eustatic sea level change will not be affected by this local basin scale tectonic event. Yes, definitely in that particular basin we can have a different scenario which will be determined by the amount of subsidence going on in that particular basin and the amount of global sea level rise or global sea level fall, which will finally control the relative sea level position of that particular basin. But the effect of this subsidence is not going to affect the global sea level change over across the globe. So, eustatic sea level change is independent of these local factors, these local geological processes. It is solely dependent on very large scale global processes. So, as I told you in the previous slide that there can be two major reasons or two major causes for eustatic sea level change. So, one is the mass of the world ocean. So, how can we get changes in the mass of the world ocean? Number one is by addition or decrease of amount of water into the ocean water. So, melting of continental ice sheets, say for example, just think of today's Antarctic or today's Arctic's conditions. So, we get thick ice cover on the entire continent of Antarctic, and when that ice even partially melts, particularly during the summers, what we get, huge amount of melt out water comes out and gets added into the ocean. Also, we all know that we are going through a greenhouse phase now, and during this greenhouse phase we are very much concerned about the melting of the polar ice. So that melting of polar ice is adding lot of water, huge amount of water into the oceans, and that is adding up the water level, increasing the water level significantly, and there are chances that in next few decades some of the low lying countries may be completely inundated due to this overall increase in water level across the globe. Just the reverse of this can happen when we get accumulation of ice sheets, because when in continental scale ice sheets form, say for example during the ice house conditions, the supply of water is basically from the oceans. So definitely the ocean water level will fall, will decrease when this kind of large scale continental scale ice sheets accumulate. So this kind of fluctuation in the sea level across the globe due to melting or accumulation of continental ice sheets is commonly called as glacioeustasy. We have discussed a bit about this glacioeustasy in our previous class on cyclicity. So I will ask you to go back to that part and you can see what are the effects of glacioeustasy on sedimentary cycles. And the second one is the kind of water cycle, that is the redistribution of water between snow, surface water, soil moisture and groundwater storage, which commonly changes the mass of water available in the oceans in a cyclic fashion. So for some time the amount of mass of water available in the ocean may be a bit higher, or maybe sometimes it may be little bit lower. So this is in normal hydrological cycles and we call this as hydroeustasy. So these are the common causes which changes or controls the mass of the world ocean, the mass of the water present in the world ocean, and definitely that will control that what is the water level, seawater level across the globe, across all the oceans. The second parameter or second factor is the change in volume of the world ocean, which is also responsible for eustatic sea level change. So what are the factors that control the changes in volume of the world ocean? Number one is the variations in the ocean water density as a result of cooling or warming of water. Commonly we call it as thermospheric changes. Second one, change in the salinity of water, which will produce some sort of circulations within the water, and we call it as halospheric changes. We can get seafloor spreading. So definitely it comes under tectoneustasy, where new ocean floors form, the old ocean floors they can get consumed and supercontinents may form, supercontinents may break, and we can get different ocean floors. Sometimes it is a major ocean with mostly the deep oceanic part, or sometimes it can be some or few shallow oceans where the shelf part is the dominant one. So accordingly, in the first case the water level will go down, globally the sea level will fall. In the second case the sea level will rise. So seafloor spreading or like tectonics, drifting the continental plates away from each other, closer to each other, consumption of the sea floors, consumption of the ocean plates. So all these comes under tectoneustasy, which is one of the major cause for eustatic sea level change in different scales. Again, I will refer back to our class on cyclicity. So there already we have discussed that how tectoneustasy controls the changes in stratigraphic successions in terms of first order cycle, second order cycle, third order cycle, etc. And definitely sedimentation, because many a times in certain basins the amount of sedimentation, accumulation of sediments can lead to certain rise or fall, particularly the rise in the ocean water volume, and it can change the overall volume available for the water body, overall volume of the ocean basin itself, and that can produce change in the eustatic sea level condition. So basically eustatic sea level change is controlled by change in the mass that means the amount of water available, or the change in the volume of the ocean basin itself, or sometimes the volume of the water available. So, how these factors work for inducing eustatic changes? Continuing differentiation of the lithospheric material as a result of plate tectonic processes, which is a major factor controlling the eustatic changes. So, in this process what happens? The volume of water in the oceans may be added by contributions from mid-oceanic ridge or from the island arc volcanisms. So, in that way the net amount of water is increased, and that will lead to the change in the eustatic sea level condition. Similarly, changes in the volumetric capacity of the ocean basins, which can be changed by, which can be caused by sediment accumulation or by sediment abstraction. So, within ocean basins in different parts we are getting a kind of imbalance in terms of amount of sediment supplied and the amount of sediment consumed. So, as a result of that, the net sediment amount accumulating across an entire ocean basin, that volume may change, and that accumulation will lead to reduction in the volume available in that particular ocean basin. So, as a result of that, there will be eustatic sea level change, or there can be changes in the volumetric capacity of the ocean basins, which may be induced by volume changes in the mid-ocean ridge system. How it can change? The bathymetry of the ocean is dependent on age. So, we commonly get the older crust, ocean floor, away from the ridge system. When the rate of spreading is very fast, then the ridges are very hot, and during those phases these hot ridges are more voluminous, creating more displacement of water. So, in such cases we can expect a rise in the global sea level. The reverse will occur, reverse will happen when it is a slow spreading ridge. There it is not that hot, so the amount of volume displacement of water body will be much less, and as a result of that overall global sea level rise will be quite less during those phases. Similarly, we can get reduction of the available water by locking up in polar ice caps and the glaciers. So, commonly we call this as the glacioeustasy, which also causes overall change in the mass and volume of the water body itself. The reverse will occur when the glaciers will melt. So, lot of capped water will get free and will be added on into the ocean water, and overall volume of the ocean water will increase. And as I told you earlier, the hydrological cycles, which may include some very intense desiccation events due to some evaporation of the inland basins and the associated marginal seas, which may cause global sea level rise in other ocean basins. So, these factors control how the volume and the mass of ocean water, volume of the ocean basin, that varies, and these factors together controls that what will be the sea level across the globe. That means what will be the eustatic sea level condition. So, any variation in these factors will lead to change in the global sea level. So, we will call that as eustatic sea level rise or eustatic sea level fall. As these factors control the accommodation space, so they are creating accommodation space or they are destroying or decreasing the accommodation space over preferentially very large areas. So, this is created by the interaction of these factors at different magnitudes and over varying time scales that yields the cyclic rock record. So, now the question arises over here that how can we understand that a particular rock succession is representing eustatic control, and eustatic control during sedimentation, during the formation of that particular stratigraphic succession. So, there are certain signatures. For example, the sedimentary succession that will form under some eustatic control, say for example during a eustatic rise, we can expect that they will be going through or they are accumulating within a particular accommodation condition. So, they can have similar tabular geometry. Such tabular geometry will suggest that the accommodation was created in almost equal amounts across the entire basin, and that is why within that accommodation the same kind of tabular sedimentary succession will form. Similarly, we can also expect some sort of synchronicity of depositional and erosional events across the entire basin. And the third one is the lack of source area rejuvenation. So, that will lead to the absence of conglomerates or this kind of coarser clastics along the proximal rim of the basin. So, these are some of the factors we can use as a clue to understand that this particular sedimentary succession or this particular part of the sedimentary sequence is formed under one particular type of eustatic change. Definitely there may be several local scale variations with respect to changes in the relative sea level condition in that particular basin. So, these clues, these points that I am discussing over here are broadly based on just considering the eustatic sea level change. If we add on the changes related to relative sea level fluctuations, the factors for identification, the factors for interpretation will vary. So, relative sea level change result in either a fall or rise in the sea level that cannot be considered as eustatic, that cannot be considered as equivalent to global scale, as the volume or mass of the water does not change. This is the basic difference between eustatic sea level change and relative sea level change. So, in case of relative sea level change, it is very much confined within that particular basin and some local factors are involved. Eustatic sea level change can itself produce change in the relative sea level, but along with the eustatic sea level change, there can be other local factors which can affect and control what will be the relative sea level condition in that particular basin. So, we will discuss about the relative sea level change in our next class. So, these are some of the reference for further study. So, thank you everybody.